As has been said over these last several days, when the three levels of life, existence, mind, coined the nitty-gritty, the airy-fairy and the transcendental, we find ourselves in a state that's called Satchitananda, sometimes called Satori. And like the water, the yeast and the flour, when they come together to combine to make dough, so it is that we find ourselves in this new state of awareness. But in that state, we're somewhat like an astronaut that's traveled into outer space. The laws of life, as we knew and practiced them, are no longer relevant, no longer operational. So perhaps this story will be a metaphor for what it is that's being said. It's also somewhat of an allegory. So let's see what comes of it from our awareness and our experience. There was a very young man who from the earliest age was interested in all things spiritual. He studied the writings of the great teachers, the ancients, the masters. He practiced the rituals. But after some time, he realized that there was something lacking in his life. He knew nothing about the arcane, the occult, magic. So, living in Jerusalem as he did, he heard that there were many sorcerers and magicians in Egypt. So he decided to travel to this far distant land to learn the ways of magic. Now, not wanting to make that long travel alone, and because of the dangers along the road, he joined a caravan. And during the days of the long travel, he befriended a certain merchant, and he told this merchant of what it was that he was intending. Well, the merchant said to him, "Oh, I know a sorcerer that I can introduce you to, and I'm sure if you ask him, he will take you on as an apprentice." So our young seeker took down the name and the directions how to get to this sorcerer's house. And when they arrived in Cairo, he made his way directly to this abode. But to his very great surprise, it was not a mansion, it was not palatial, it was just a very humble house. And when the door was opened, he found that he was confronted by what was obviously a very ordinary man. Well, no wizard's hat and no capes or anything of this nature. So he was greatly surprised and a little bit reticent, but he was invited in and given hospitality, and he told the sorcerer, so-called, of what his quest was. Well, the sorcerer said, "Yes, I know the ways of magic, and because you've been introduced by my very good friend the merchant, I would be willing to take you on as my apprentice." Well, our young seeker was a little bit reticent again about this, because he thought, well, he doesn't look like a sorcerer, he doesn't act like a sorcerer or a wizard. And so he kind of fumbled and he said, well, actually I was kind of looking for someone about my own age. And the sorcerer, of course, realized that he wasn't believing that he knew the ways of magic, so he decided that he'd teach this young man a thing or two. So the sorcerer said, well, as a matter of fact, I do know a young wizard who would probably be happy to take you on as his apprentice, but stay a while, let me cook you a little meal. And so the young man readily accepted this request, and the wizard brought out a very fine bottle of wine. He said, this is a very fine wine. And when the young man tasted it, he thought, oh yes, this tastes like the best wine that I've ever imbibed. So, but at that moment, there was a knock on the door. And the wizard, being somewhat now occupied in preparing a meal for his guest, said to the young, oh, would you mind answering the door? So the young man got up, and as he was walking across the room to where the front door was situated, there in front of him, he saw a well. Now, he didn't remember this well being in the middle of the living room before, but before he knew it, because of the impetus of his walk, he fell right in. And he felt himself plummeting down and down and swirling down and down and down. And quite breathless, he thought he'd never get to the bottom, when suddenly he found himself being able to rise up and get his head above water. But instead of being at the top of the well, he was in a great river. And because he was a good swimmer, he was able to go and be carried along by the river and get himself to a bank. Well, when he dragged himself up onto the bank, he found himself in this very, very strange place. But as he wandered, feeling very hungry and very thirsty, he came across what forest, more like an orchard, filled with trees with all kinds of fruit. So he was able to partake of this wonderful fruit and be satiated and quench his thirst at the same time. But after he'd done so, he found himself totally lost. He felt like he was in some kind of maze. So he wandered aimlessly until finally, just ahead of him, he found a pathway opening. And taking that pathway and following it for some distance, he came to what was obviously a city. No place like he'd ever seen before. But when he entered the city, it was abuzz with people. It was obviously a very, very wealthy place, because there seemed to be glittering jewels and all over the place. But as with most cities, along the main thoroughfare, there were scribes. But when the young man looked, all of the scribes were busy at their work with someone, as it is, translating letters or writing letters for those. But there was one scribe who sat alone. So the young man approached the scribe and asked him, please, would you write a letter to my home to tell my family that I'm well and I intend to return? And the scribe said, well, where is it that you come from? And the young man said, I come from Jerusalem. Jerusalem? Said the scribe. Jerusalem? And then he turned to the other scribes and he said, have you ever heard of a place called Jerusalem? And they all said, no. Well, the young man was just taken aback. How could it be that they did not know about the greatest city in the world, Jerusalem? Well, the young man said, well, in actual fact, I do know how to write, but I was wanting to find out what this city was about. Oh, said the scribe, well, write something for me. So the young man wrote. And when the scribe looked at his script, he said, why, that's the most beautiful script I've ever seen. And he showed the script written by the young man to all the other scribes. And they too said, yes, they'd never seen such beautiful penmanship. And they said, well, this has to be brought to the attention of our monarch. So the young man was taken to the monarch, and when he too saw this script that the young man was writing, he was so impressed, he immediately brought the young man into his service. Well, time passed, and because of the qualities and knowledge of this young man, he came to be an advisor of the king, close advisor. But the young man longed to return to his home. So he went to the king and told him that he wished to leave. The king said, oh, won't you stay just another year? To which the young man agreed. And the year passed, and after that year, when he went to the king again, the king said, I don't want you to go. No, I'll give you my daughter in marriage. Well, this was an offer the young man couldn't refuse. So he married the king's daughter. And they lived happily. They had a son. One day, when the young man was out in his garden, playing with his son, all of a sudden, his son, running to retrieve a ball, fell into the well in the garden. And when our young man heard his cries, he immediately went over, and without a second thought, he dived into the well to save his son. And he felt himself falling, and falling, and falling. But instead of reaching the bottom of the well or finding himself in water, he found himself back in the living room of the sorcerer, who seemed to be expecting him. And the sorcerer said, well, have you learned a little of the way of magic? Oh no, said the young man. I was the king's advisor, and I fell down the well, and I became and told the sorcerer the whole story. And the sorcerer said, well, don't you perhaps realize that the way of magic is to bring us to that place where we can realize the illusory nature of all things? The young man realized something within him merged his knowledge, his questing, and this experience of magic. He bowed to the sorcerer, asked him, would he be accepted as the sorcerer's apprentice? After some years, he too became a great, great magician. What does this story tell us about this place in which we find ourselves when the levels of mind, existence, life that nitty-gritty cause and effect, the dreams, the intuitions, and our recognition of the interrelatedness of things place us in that state of Satori, which is the astronaut now in outer space, so called, where the mind and the body have to adapt to the new way of relating to life. What's your experience? Those 3 levels, now one. How do we adapt? How does our mind adjust to its new way of relating to life? Could it be that we have to explore magic? Become divine sorcerers as well as divine physicians, divine alchemists? Maybe we have to explore the magic, become those divine sorcerers. Thank you.